On the evening of May 24, 1941, Winston Churchill received news that would haunt him for the next 3 days. HMS Hood, the pride of the Royal Navy, the largest warship in the world, the symbol of British naval supremacy for 2 decades, had been destroyed in a battle lasting less than 10 minutes. A single shell from the German battleship Bismarck had penetrated her deck, reached her ammunition magazines, and triggered an explosion that broke the mighty vessel in half. Of her crew of 1,418 men, only 3 survived. The shock that rippled through Britain was profound, visceral, and immediate. Hood was not just a ship. She was an institution, a floating embodiment of everything the Royal Navy represented. Her loss demanded response, and that response would become the largest naval manhunt in history. Churchill's order to the Admiralty was simple and absolute: sink the Bismarck. Every available ship was to be committed to the pursuit. No consideration of fuel, of other obligations, of strategic risk was to stand in the way. The German battleship that had killed Hood must be found and destroyed, not merely for military reasons, but for the restoration of British pride and the demonstration that Britannia still ruled the waves. Over the next 4 days, 42 British warships would join the hunt, converging from across the Atlantic in a desperate race against time, weather, and the vast emptiness of the ocean. The Bismarck herself was a formidable adversary, perhaps the most powerful surface warship afloat in the spring of 1941. She displaced over 50,000 tons fully loaded, carried 8 15-inch guns in 4 twin turrets, and was protected by armor that could resist the heaviest shells at typical battle ranges. Her speed of 30 knots allowed her to outrun most pursuers and choose her engagements. She represented the pinnacle of German naval engineering, designed to commerce raiding operations that could devastate British supply lines without risking the direct fleet confrontation that Germany could not win. Her mission, codenamed Rheinübung, was to break into the Atlantic, rendezvous with the heavy cruiser Prince Eugen, and wreak havoc on the convoys that kept Britain alive. The battle in the Denmark Strait that destroyed Hood was supposed to be a minor obstacle on Bismarck's path to the Atlantic. The British had positioned 2 ships to intercept Hood and the new battleship Prince of Wales, but the German squadron was confident of fighting through. What followed was a gunnery duel that demonstrated both the devastating power of modern naval weapons and the fragility of even the mightiest warships. Hood, designed in the years after the First World War when speed was prioritized over protection, carried armor that was inadequate against plunging fire at long range. Bismarck's 5th salvo found the weakness. The explosion that followed was visible from both ships, a pillar of flame and debris that marked the death of 1,500 men in a single catastrophic instant. Prince of Wales, newly commissioned and still working up with civilian technicians aboard, was hit multiple times and forced to withdraw. She had scored hits of her own on Bismarck. One shell had ruptured fuel tanks, another had damaged a boiler room, but the German ship remained operational and dangerous. As the British cruisers Norfolk and Suffolk shadowed the enemy at the edge of radar range, reporting position and course, the Admiralty began assembling the forces that would avenge Hood's death. The geography of the hunt was daunting. Bismarck had broken through the Denmark Strait, the narrow passage between Iceland and Greenland, and was now heading southwest into the open Atlantic. Before her lay thousands of miles of empty ocean, multiple possible destinations, and the prospect of disappearing entirely if the shadowing cruisers lost contact. Behind her, scattered across the Atlantic and hurrying from ports throughout the British Isles, were the ships that would hunt her down. Force H from Gibraltar, including the aircraft carrier Ark Royal and the battlecruiser Renown. The battleships King George V and Rodney from the home fleet. Cruisers and destroyers from convoy escorts, from patrol duties, from wherever they could be found. The net was wide, but the ocean was wider. Admiral John Tovey, commanding the pursuit from King George V, faced a problem of mathematics as much as tactics. Bismarck was fast, well-armed, and heading toward friendly waters where U-boats and aircraft could provide support. The British ships pursuing her were scattered across hundreds of miles, their fuel states varying, their positions imperfectly known. If Bismarck maintained her current course and speed, she would reach the protection of German air cover within days. The window for interception was narrow and closing. Everything depended on maintaining contact with the enemy and slowing her down before she could escape. The first crisis came on the night of May 24th, when Bismarck successfully evaded her shadowers. The cruisers Norfolk and Suffolk, which had been tracking the German ship by radar, lost contact when Bismarck turned sharply and crossed behind them. For hours, the British had no idea where their quarry was, whether she was continuing toward France, doubling back toward Germany, or heading for some unexpected destination. The pursuing forces, strung out across the Atlantic and burning fuel they could not easily replace, groped blindly in the darkness. The hunt seemed on the verge of failure before it had properly begun. The contact was regained through a combination of luck and signals intelligence. Bismarck's commander, Admiral Gunther Lütjens, transmitted a lengthy radio message to German naval headquarters, apparently unaware that the British had lost him. Direction-finding stations across Britain triangulated the transmission, providing a fix on Bismarck's position that allowed the pursuit to resume. The error was characteristic of Lütjens, a cautious and somewhat pessimistic officer who seems to have believed the British were still tracking him throughout the period of lost contact. His radio silence might have saved his ship. His decision to break it sealed its fate. The next phase of the hunt was a race against time and fuel. Bismarck was heading for Brest, on the French Atlantic coast, where German air cover and repair facilities awaited. The pursuing British forces were coming from multiple directions: Tovey from the northwest, Force H from the south, Rodney from a convoy escort position to the west, but none could intercept before Bismarck reached safety unless her speed was reduced. The only weapon available that might accomplish this was the Swordfish torpedo bomber, an obsolete biplane that looked like a relic from the previous war, but remained the Fleet Air Arm's primary strike aircraft. Ark Royal, approaching from the south with Force H, launched her Swordfish on the afternoon of May 26. The first strike was a disaster of misidentification. The pilots, navigating through heavy weather with unreliable instruments, attacked the cruiser Sheffield, which was shadowing Bismarck from a different bearing. Only the failure of their magnetic torpedo detonators, which exploded prematurely on contact with the water, prevented the destruction of a British ship by British aircraft. The Swordfish returned to Ark Royal, rearmed with contact-fused torpedoes, and prepared for a second attempt. The second strike, launched in deteriorating weather as evening approached, would prove decisive. 15 Swordfish, flying through rain squalls and anti-aircraft fire, pressed their attacks against a battleship that outweighed each of them by a factor of 1,000. Bismarck's gunners, accustomed to engaging targets moving at hundreds of miles per hour, found the slow-moving biplanes difficult to hit. Their fire control systems, designed for surface combat, struggled to track aircraft that approached at barely 100 knots. The Swordfish came in low, dropped their torpedoes, and turned away into the murk. Most of the torpedoes missed. One struck Bismarck amidships, causing minor damage. One struck her stern, jamming her rudders and crippling her ability to steer. The impact of that single torpedo hit cannot be overstated. Bismarck, one of the most powerful warships ever built, was reduced in an instant from a fast and dangerous adversary to a crippled vessel that could barely maneuver. Her rudders were jammed 15 degrees to port, forcing her into a slow circle that she could not correct. Efforts to steer using her propellers alone proved inadequate. She could still fight, Her guns and fire control were undamaged. But she could no longer escape. The aircraft that had seemed so pathetic, the attack that had seemed so desperate, had accomplished what the big guns of Hood and Prince of Wales had failed to achieve. Bismarck was doomed. The night that followed was a torment for both sides. British destroyers, directed to the scene by Ark Royal's sighting reports, conducted torpedo attacks through darkness and heavy seas. Their weapons scored no confirmed hits, but the attacks forced Bismarck's crew to remain at battle stations, exhausted and increasingly aware that morning would bring the end. Aboard King George V and Rodney, approaching from the northwest, officers and men prepared for the battle that would conclude the hunt. They knew they were facing a wounded enemy, but they also knew that Bismarck's guns could still kill. The night was long and the tension was palpable. Dawn on May the 27th revealed a grey and angry sea, with Bismarck visible on the horizon, still moving but clearly unable to escape. Rodney opened fire at 8:47 in the morning, King George V following a minute later. The British battleships approached from the northwest, crossing Bismarck's bow and engaging from a position that maximized their firepower while complicating the enemy's response. The German ship returned fire, her salvos falling close to Rodney in the early exchanges, but her gunnery was handicapped by the damage she had already sustained and the difficulty of firing accurately from a platform that could not maintain a steady course. The battle that followed was not a duel between equals, it was an execution. British shells struck Bismarck repeatedly, destroying her fire control systems, silencing her turrets one by one, setting fires that spread through her superstructure. Within half an hour, she was no longer fighting back, her guns silent, her upper works a shambles of twisted steel and burning wreckage. Yet she remained afloat, her hull integrity maintained by the same robust construction that had made her so formidable. The British ships closed to point-blank range, pouring shells into a target that could no longer resist, trying to sink a vessel that seemed determined not to die. The final destruction of Bismarck has been debated by historians ever since. The British believed their shells and torpedoes sent her to the bottom. German survivors insisted that scuttling charges set by the crew to prevent capture were the ultimate cause. Modern expeditions to the wreck, which lies nearly 16,000 feet below the surface, have found evidence supporting both interpretations. The hull shows extensive damage from British weapons, but the seacocks were open when she sank, suggesting that the crew did indeed take action to hasten the end. Perhaps both are true. Perhaps it no longer matters. Bismarck sank at 10:39 on the morning of May 27, 1941, taking over 2,000 of her crew with her. Only 116 survived to be rescued by British ships before U-boat warnings forced the rescuers to withdraw. The hunt for Bismarck had lasted 8 days, from her departure from Gotenhafen on May 18th to her destruction on May 27th. It had involved 42 British warships, from battleships to destroyers, plus aircraft from carriers and land bases, plus submarines positioned to intercept if she reached French waters. It had cost Britain the Hood, with nearly all her crew, plus damage to Prince of Wales and the lives of airmen lost in the attacks. It had consumed vast quantities of fuel and diverted forces from convoy protection at a time when U-boats were sinking shipping at catastrophic rates. By any rational calculation, the resources expended were disproportionate to the threat eliminated. One German battleship, however dangerous, could not justify the commitment of the entire home fleet. But the hunt was never entirely rational. It was driven by emotion as much as strategy, by the need to avenge Hood and restore the Royal Navy's prestige, by Churchill's personal determination that Bismarck must not escape. The Prime Minister followed the pursuit obsessively, demanding updates at all hours, intervening in operational decisions that should have been left to naval commanders. His famous order, "Sink the Bismarck," was not merely an instruction, but an imperative, freighted with political and psychological significance that transcended military considerations. Britain needed a victory, needed to demonstrate that German surface raiders could not operate with impunity, needed to prove that the loss of Hood would be answered in kind. The strategic implications of Bismarck's destruction extended far beyond the immediate tactical situation. Hitler, already skeptical of surface ship operations after earlier losses, became even more reluctant to risk his remaining capital ships. Tirpitz, Bismarck's sister, would spend most of the war hiding in Norwegian fjords, a fleet in being that tied down British resources but never sorted against the convoys she was built to destroy. The German surface fleet, which had begun the war with ambitious plans for commerce raiding, was effectively neutralized by the loss of a single ship and the caution that loss engendered. The Battle of the Atlantic would be fought by U-boats, not battleships, and the submarines would prove far more dangerous than the surface raiders had ever been. For the Royal Navy, the Bismarck hunt was both triumph and warning. Triumph because the enemy's most powerful ship had been found and destroyed, because the fleet had demonstrated its ability to concentrate forces across vast distances, because British naval supremacy had been vindicated in the most dramatic fashion possible. Warning because Hood's loss revealed vulnerabilities that could not be ignored, because the pursuit had stretched resources to the breaking point, because a victory had depended on a single torpedo hit from an obsolete aircraft that might easily have missed. The margin between success and failure had been razor thin, and everyone involved knew it. The human stories from the hunt illuminate the statistics in ways that numbers alone cannot. The three survivors of Hood, ordinary signalman Ted Briggs, able seaman Robert Tilburn, and midshipman William Dundas, would carry the memory of their ship's destruction for the rest of their lives. Briggs, who had been on the compass platform when the fatal hit occurred, was blown into the water by the explosion and surfaced to find himself alone in a sea of oil and debris. He was 18 years old. The 1,500 shipmates who had been alive minutes earlier were gone, their bodies entombed in the wreck that was already settling toward the bottom. He would spend decades answering questions about those few minutes, trying to explain something that resisted explanation. The crew of Bismarck faced their own ordeal, fighting a battle they could not win, watching their ship disintegrate around them, while British shells continued to fall. Survivors described scenes of horror as compartments filled with smoke and flame, as wounded men were carried to aid stations that were themselves being destroyed, as the ship's list increased and it became clear that the end was near. When the order finally came to abandon ship, many were too wounded or too trapped to obey. Others jumped into water covered with burning oil, struggling to swim clear before the suction of the sinking hull pulled them down. The British rescue efforts, curtailed by U-boat warnings, left hundreds of men in the water who would not survive. The aviators of Ark Royal's swordfish squadrons performed feats that seemed impossible even as they accomplished them. Flying aircraft designed in the early 1930s, fabric-covered biplanes with open cockpits and a maximum speed barely exceeding 100 miles per hour, they attacked a modern battleship defended by dozens of anti-aircraft guns and all the technology that German engineering could provide. Their survival was as improbable as their success. The low speed that made them seem easy targets actually complicated the enemy's fire control, causing shells to pass overhead. Their fabric skins allowed anti-aircraft rounds to pass through without detonating the fuses designed for metal aircraft. They were, in a sense, too primitive to be killed efficiently. The torpedo that crippled Bismarck was dropped by a crew whose names are recorded in history. Sub-Lieutenant John Moffat was the pilot, Sub-Lieutenant J.D. Miller, the observer, leading airman A.J. Hayman, the telegraphist, air gunner. Moffat would live to be 97, spending his later years reflecting on the moment that changed the course of the battle. He remembered the approach through anti-aircraft fire, the release of the torpedo at close range, the frantic turn away as Bismarck's guns tracked his fragile aircraft. He did not know in that moment where his torpedo had struck or what damage it had caused. He learned only later that his weapon had delivered the blow that sealed the German ship's fate. The responsibility weighed on him. Thousands of men had died because his torpedo had found its mark, but he understood that war demanded such actions and such consequences. Admiral Lütjens, commanding the German squadron, remains a controversial figure in the history of the operation. His decision to engage Hood and Prince of Wales, when he might have avoided battle and continued into the Atlantic, has been criticized by some historians as unnecessarily aggressive. His radio transmission after losing his shadowers, which revealed his position to British direction finding, was clearly an error that contributed to his ship's destruction. Yet he was also a professional naval officer facing impossible odds, commanding a squadron on a mission that was strategically questionable from the outset. He died on Bismarck's bridge, along with most of his staff, when British shells destroyed the command spaces early in the final battle. His body was never recovered. The wreck of Bismarck was discovered in June 1989 by an expedition led by Robert Ballard, the oceanographer who had found Titanic 4 years earlier. The ship lies upright on the sea floor, her hull largely intact despite the damage visible on her upper works. The destruction wrought by British shells is evident in photographs. Turrets blown from their barbettes, superstructure collapsed, armor plates holed by direct hits. But the fundamental structure of the ship survived the battle and the long fall to the bottom. Ballard's expedition confirmed that the hull showed no evidence of catastrophic structural failure, supporting German claims that the ship was scuttled rather than sunk by enemy action. The debate continues, but the distinction matters more to historians than to the men who died. Hood's wreck, discovered by a British expedition in 2001, tells a different and more tragic story. The ship lies in 3 main pieces, her hull broken by the magazine explosion that destroyed her. The site is designated a war grave under British law, and access is restricted to prevent disturbance of the remains. Nearly 1,500 men lie within and around the wreckage, their resting place marked by the debris of the vessel they served. Expeditions have placed memorial plaques on the wreck, honoring the dead and acknowledging the sacrifice that the Bismarck hunt was meant to avenge. The 3 survivors, all now deceased, lived long enough to see their ship found, but not to visit the grave they so narrowly escaped. The Bismarck hunt has been the subject of countless books, documentaries, and films, its drama ensuring enduring popular interest in an engagement that lasted barely a week. The story contains elements that resonate across decades: the shocking destruction of a legendary warship, the desperate pursuit across stormy seas, the seemingly hopeless attack by obsolete aircraft, the final battle that was more execution than combat. It is a narrative that lends itself to heroic treatment, and it has received such treatment from generations of writers and filmmakers. Yet the reality was more complex, more costly, and more ambiguous than the heroic version suggests. The men who died, British, German, all of them caught in a conflict they had not chosen, deserve to be remembered as individuals rather than statistics. Each of the 1,500 men lost on Hood had a name, a family, a history that ended in a flash of flame on a May morning in the Denmark Strait. Each of the 2,000 men lost on Bismarck had similar claims to memory and mourning. The victors wrote the history, as victors always do. But the dead on both sides were equally dead, their futures equally foreclosed, their families equally bereaved. War does not distinguish between the righteous and the wicked when it distributes its costs. The pursuit of Bismarck demonstrated what the Royal Navy could accomplish when fully mobilized against a single threat. 42 ships, hundreds of aircraft, thousands of men, all converging on a single target across thousands of miles of ocean. The coordination required was staggering, the communications challenging, the logistics barely adequate. That it succeeded, that Bismarck was found, slowed, and destroyed before she could escape, was a testament to British naval professionalism and also to German errors that a more careful opponent might have avoided. Victory was not inevitable. It was earned at tremendous cost, through effort and sacrifice and no small amount of luck. 8 days, 42 ships, one obsession. The hunt for Bismarck was all of these things: a military operation, a psychological necessity, a demonstration of national will. It succeeded in its immediate objective, destroying the ship that had killed Hood and eliminating the threat of German surface raiders in the Atlantic. It succeeded in its broader purpose, restoring British confidence and demonstrating that the Royal Navy remained the dominant force in European waters. But it also revealed the cost that such dominance required, the resources that had to be expended, the lives that had to be lost. The Atlantic would remain contested for years to come, and the real threat, the U-boats that killed more ships than Bismarck could ever have sunk, would demand even greater sacrifices before the war was won. Churchill got what he wanted. Bismarck was sunk. Hood was avenged. The Royal Navy had demonstrated that no enemy ship could challenge it and survive. The photographs of Bismarck's final moments, shells splashing around her as she burned and listed, became iconic images of British naval power. The names of the ships and men involved entered history, commemorated in memorials and remembered in ceremonies decades after the last survivor had passed. The hunt was over, and Britain had won. But the ocean keeps its own counsel, and the dead do not celebrate victories. Bismarck lies in darkness 3 miles down, her guns silent, her crew entombed in compartments that will never see light again. Hood lies broken in the Denmark Strait, her sailors scattered through the wreckage of the ship they served. The water that witnessed their battle flows on, indifferent to the passions that drove men to kill and die in the grey wastes of the North Atlantic. The hunt for Bismarck was a triumph and a tragedy, a demonstration of human courage and human folly, a story that continues to resonate because it speaks to something fundamental about war and the terrible things that nations ask of those who serve them. Sink the Bismarck, Churchill's order was fulfilled, the cost was paid. History recorded the result, and the sea, as always, kept what it was given.